Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Matthew Sitman. Matt, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Matt Sitman. I'm the associate editor of Commonweal magazine, and I co-host a podcast called Know Your Enemy. I also write frequently for Dissent, and I'm on their editorial board. And so Commonweal, Dissent, and Know Your Enemy are my three big affiliations.
So thanks for coming on. So we're mainly...
No problem. I'm actually an old school Blogging Heads fan.
Well, that's great. You said
watched years ago.
You said this was your lifelong dream, and it's finally come true to appear on Blogging.
Finally crossed this off the bucket list.
Yeah, and we had, I guess, like a professional relationship roughly a decade ago, because you once were an editor at Andrew Sullivan's blog, and we worked together then, several lifetimes ago.
Yeah, no, it's true. I was the literary editor, and for a while there, we were featuring Blogging Heads content on the weekends.
Yes.
And so you and I were the two peons, to our masters, Andrew and Bob Wright, handling the details of that.
Yeah, this is true. And then and that was for people, just a throwback, a flashback Friday for you listeners. This was the show My Report that ran for a couple of years and was people from the Yale University psychology department. And then one of those people, Laurie Santos, has since become one of the most famous sort of online teacher type people, because she has this course. She launched this course called Happiness, or How to Find Happiness or something, and it it's become the most popular online course in history or something. So she really blew up since then. And I think Tamar Gendler is now one of the deans at Yale. So everyone is onwards and upwards since then. But so thanks for coming on. So we're mainly going to be talking about your podcast, Know Your Enemy, which you co-host with Sam Adler-Bell. That's correct,
right? Yes.
And I think I got into it a little later than maybe other people, but towards the end of the Trump administration, I was listening to it. Well, I think the podcast launched in 2019. Is that right?
Yes.
So I'm more towards the end of before the election. I got into listening to some of your back catalog and thought it was really interesting. And then a lot of the period between the election and the inauguration also had lots of strange things happening, and you guys did a great episode immediately after the Capitol riot, insurrection, whatever we want to call it, on January 6th. So I would the log line for the show I would give is leftists looking at the conservative movement and analyzing it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. You say you got into it recently, but really when we started it, I don't know. I think it takes a while for podcasts sometimes to find their voice or find their footing or figure out what they really want to do. And even though when Sam and I started the podcast, we were just two good friends who would often talk about the things we talk about on the podcast. So we thought, well, maybe we should, take the plunge and become two more white men in New York City who have a podcast. But not just as the Trump administration kind of continued on, but as the conservative intellectuals kind of caught up to it, that really, I think some of those episodes where we talked about the illiberal right, things like Catholic integralists, the emergence of Josh Hawley types who are kind of, trying to present themselves as friend of the working class. There was a lot of interesting things happening on the right. Trump, yes, but also among the conservative intellectuals. And so I think, we've done more stuff about Trump and things related to him on the intellectual right than we anticipated going into it, because we thought it'd be maybe more history and background and kind of, looking at National Review and Bill Buckley and some of the conservative intellectuals. So it's, it's continued to evolve and change. But I think, more recently we've sort of found our footing. So you started listening at the time.
So I did go back and listen to some of the early episodes. And so you're starting off with talking about Edmund Burke and other things deep in the, history of conservative thought. And then you start bringing on guests, and is there like an entry episode that you would recommend if someone is their curiosity is piqued right now? Where would you recommend they start at episode 1? I think it's been about 30 or so.
Yeah,
public episodes.
We've done 30 free in front of the paywall episodes. We also have a Patreon. And we've been doing more bonus episodes too that are pretty substantial. But for an entry point for people, I mean, I don't know. It really depends what their interests are. I would say one of our most listened to episodes was one we did right around the new year on the fascism question. Is Trump a fascist, or should we apply that label to him? And we did a lot of work on that one, and it was one of the episodes we've gotten the most kind of positive feedback on, even from people who sort of disagreed with where we landed. But some of our interviews, we've had Sam Moyn, Jamel Bowie, Nicole Hemmer. Her episode on Rush Limbaugh we did recently because she studies conservative media.
Yes.
That's one a lot of people liked. So you can I would just say, if people are looking for an entry point, to pick one that just strikes them as interesting based on the guest or the topic or whatever.
Yeah, okay, so you don't need to necessarily start at the beginning, even though there is some sort of chronological or prefatory part.
Yeah, I think like all podcasts, you sort of, there's the Know Your Enemy extended cinematic universe of people, that especially me as an ex-conservative, maybe we can talk about that some more.
Yeah, for sure.
But that background, it means certain people I used to know are now in the news or, caught up in the Trump stuff somehow. Different people we come back to again and again. So if you don't know who Adrian Vermeule is, say, for example, you might have to look that up if you don't start early on. But
right. Just as a side note, I realized I can't remember if I caught the Integral List episode, but at least you guys talk about those types when you're talking in the episode about the West Coast Straussians, but I realize I'm blocked by at least 2 of these types on Twitter.
I'm not surprised.
Amari,
they're really snowflakes.
Yeah, Amari and Vermeule both blocked me, and so did what's his name? The guy who wrote the Bonhoeffer biography.
Eric Metaxas. Yeah,
Eric Metaxas. So actually, I share. Strangely, he was a member of the same humor magazine in college that I was the editor of. One year he wrote for it like 20 years previous. So I just like sort of knew that he was a writer, and then he sort of went in this other strange direction. But anyway, we're getting into minutia. Yeah, I think the first episode I listened to was the one with David Cleon, who used to work for Blogging Heads as well, and he was talking about Norman Podhoretz's memoir, Making It, and that was an interesting one. Because that was okay. So, and the occasion for that was it was like reissued on its 50th anniversary or something along those lines by New York Review of Books or something.
Yeah, it had been recently reissued, and so in the past, it wasn't right around the time of the episode. It wasn't timed to that exactly, but in the past year or maybe 2 years previously, it happened. So there was a whole kind of spat of essays and articles looking back at the book. I remember there was a New York Times profile of Norman Podhoretz and his kind of how Trumpy he was or was not. And so it was like something that was getting some attention. And, it was David was great on that episode, but it's kind of like an example of one way we do an episode, meaning we pick one figure and do a deep dive, as opposed to a certain issue or topic or, a kind of collection, a kind of movement or a subset of the conservative movement, say, Straussians or neoconservatives or paleocons or Russell Kirk admirers, whatever label you want to do. Sometimes it's individuals, sometimes it's movements, sometimes it's other topics altogether.
Mm-hmm. Just as a side note, one of the things you talk about sometimes with neoconservatives is how there's all these, I don't know if you would call it inbred, there's all these family connections between the neoconservatives. They often marry each other. It's multi-generational things. So Podhoretz's son is John Podhoretz, who many people may know. And I, just as a weird person, though, I found out just a couple years ago that I am distantly related through marriage to Midge Decter, who is
Norman Podhoretz's wife.
Yeah. So one of my mom's first cousins, who is no longer alive, was married to Decter's nephew. So that is pretty big. But when I found that out, I was like, oh yeah, like that's weird. And so yeah, I don't know if if everyone who has some sort of New York Jewish connection in the 1930s is related or something. But but that I've not been able to successfully use this to advance my career like many other neoconservative second and third generation people have, sadly.
When I moved to DC for grad school, 15 years ago, it was one of the jokes I was told. I won't say who told me, but when John Podhoretz moved to DC, I forget I think he was working in the Reagan administration in some capacity. The joke was that everyone thought his name was John P. Normanson because I'm John Podhoretz, Norman's son. was the line that was used. But it's really, it's a testament to how small the conservative movement is. That's one of the things Sam and I emphasize on the show is that it's actually a pretty tight-knit group in some ways, or it's a kind of recognizable movement still. And you're kind of, and I can say this as an ex-conservative, you're kind of inculcated into it. And, you might go to certain seminars or conferences or, work with certain organizations. And so it really has a cohesive feel. I can say this as someone, again, who was very deep into the conservative movement in college and then early in grad school. It has a cohesiveness. It feels like you know people in the movement in a way that now someone on the left, obviously there are social networks and people know each other, but there's something about the kind of cohesiveness, whatever their internal fissures and arguments, there is something, again, kind of small about the conservative movement, meaning it's not surprising that lots of people are married to each other or know each other, I discover something new all the time where someone's married to someone or, there's some family connection, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and you joked about like the Know Your Enemy cinematic universe, but there is some parallel there where it's like someone who you discussed in the previous episode is like a glancing character in some other person's story, and it all sort of like comes together. And then I guess if we're using the Avengers universe thing, maybe sort of the is there sort of an endgame denouement, a big battle against Thanos, who would maybe be Obama? I don't know exactly, but anyway, we can move away from that. Okay, so so you mentioned a couple times, why don't we just talk about your history and that you were once a card-carrying member or something of the conservative movement and grew up as a conservative and then moved far from that. So can you just briefly outline how that happened?
Yeah, no, the story I like to tell is when I first started graduate school at Georgetown, I took a history seminar with Michael Kazin, the former co-editor of Dissent, someone who became a teacher and mentor to me and published me once I moved left. But he taught a seminar on American conservatism. And this was circa like 2005.
So what you were studying history?
I was studying political theory in the government department. But because Michael taught like political history, I could moonlight in the history department for a few seminars. Mm-hmm. And so he was teaching a graduate seminar on post-war U.S. conservatism, mostly because, as he put it, he was tired of losing to the right. So it's kind of like, how can we understand something they're doing that's working? But he said, I'm teaching this class as a card-carrying member of the left. And, you do the first day introduction where you go around the graduate seminar. I'm so-and-so. These are my research interests. And I threw in that I was a card-carrying member of the right. So as of 22, 23 years old, I would say that in a graduate seminar. But I'd grown up very conservative in a self-described fundamentalist Christian home, kind of Bible. The term Bible thumping, would be appropriate. Mm-hmm. And the term fundamentalist was one they embraced. It's not my pejorative. I went to a conservative Christian college as an undergraduate, and there are a lot of reasons I moved left over the years. It really, I would say, kind of started in my mid-20s, and there was it wasn't necessarily consistent or incremental. It just in the decade that followed, kind of my mid to late 20s through my early to mid 30s, the disaster of the Bush years impressed itself upon me. Mm-hmm. Things like defending torture, they're the kind of things that kind of shake you up in a way and shake you out of kind of ideological complacency. When you see people defending things that are clearly either, in the case of torture, like grotesquely immoral, or in the case of the Iraq War, just an absolute disaster, followed by the financial crash in 2007, 2008. Like those are the kinds of events that can shake a person, especially if you're in your 20s, kind of out of the convictions that you were raised with. And to maybe tie the story together, really one of the first pieces I wrote about this was in, I think it was published the summer of 2016, when Michael Kazin, I mentioned my old teacher, he was editing Dissent at the time, he said, Matt, I noticed on Twitter you're really into Bernie Sanders. He said, that's not how you were when I met you. Could you write an essay about kind of what happened? So if anyone wants more details about some of how my thinking changed, that essay is called Leaving Conservatism Behind, and it was published summer 2016 in Dissent.
Okay, and we'll track down the link, and it'll be below the video on the Blogging site. So people often, are raised in one sort of political belief and then move to a different one. And, there's also, going back to the neocons, there's famously, like, they began as sort of, far on the left or Trotskyites, you can correct me if I have any of this wrong, who, eventually moved to the right. But how did you end up where you are today as a leftist instead of a liberal or a centrist or someone who just was sick of politics altogether? How did you move?
Yeah, well, the neocon example is an interesting one because one of the lines that people might use to describe what you just articulated would be something like, see, they never stopped being radicals, right? They were, Trotskyists on the left, and then, that same movement thought they could, the Iraq War would be the first domino that fell in revolutionizing the Middle East. Like there was something radical that stayed there. And sometimes friends of mine have said, Matt, you've never just been like a moderate. You were either like a dedicated true conservative, or now you would call yourself a socialist and you're on the left, and, you're not just a kind of middle of the road Democrat or something. So maybe it has something to do with my temperament.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Which I concede, that it's not all pure, reason or simply intellectual ideas I've been persuaded by. There's probably something psychological and temperamental at work too. But I would also say, I mentioned the kind of times through which we've lived, we're part of kind of shaking up my thinking and being a part of my move left. I mean, it's not that – I feel like I'm also representative of, say, the millennial. I'm an old millennial, but, people who have lived through people who have lived through certain experiences, if they've included, say, the financial crash, and you see all your friends, maybe you yourself, leave college with massive or grad school with massive amounts of debt, and you look at the economy and what your prospects are. I don't think it's, that shocking that someone would have, if those are your formative experiences, to have, to be drawn towards political ideas that, you might call social democratic or democratic socialism, or something that names an alternative to the status quo, beyond kind of mere reform or, kind of nibbling at the edges of problems.
The way you were describing your journey reminded me a bit strangely of the last episode I did, which was with Kathy Reisenwitz about OnlyFans, and there was a profile of people who are on OnlyFans, and of the 8 or so people profiled in this article, 6 of them said they grew up in very religious households. And then she mentioned when I was talking to her that she also grew up in a very conservative religious household. And I asked, is there a link here? And she said, there's a type of person where in your childhood, sex is a big damn deal, I think was the phrase she used. And then when you're an adult, it remains a big damn deal, but you might be on the other side of it. And then she had to realize in her life that there are a lot of people out there for whom sex is not a big damn deal. And so she was somewhat unusual in that, but just, the focus on sexuality in her childhood, where she has an OnlyFans account of herself now. And, it was reports on, the sex work, from a libertarianish perspective. But anyway, I think there is sort of, there was this whole, especially online debate about horseshoe theory. But I and a lot of people on the left got mad at because it was sort of implying that, the super Bernie fan is a hop, skip, and a jump away from the alt-right. But I think there is a certain personality type that's attracted to extreme ideas or extreme movements or very energetic movements or something. And then there's another type that just wants stability and doesn't really care about all these exciting ideas and so forth. And so you can see people sort of hopping between them. And so I mentioned this on the show before, but back in 2016, the alt-right was first starting to emerge online, and I caught some shit from some of these individual guys because of something Michael Brennan Doherty retweeted of mine, and then I ended up actually having some direct message conversations with some of these people, and one of them, he's long gone from Twitter. I have no idea what happened to him. His handle was hipster fascist. And we got to chatting, and he said that he had once been a socialist, and he was going to art school, and then he couldn't pay for it anymore and had to drop out. And I was joking with him, well, an art student socialist who becomes a fascist, we've heard this story at least once before. Yeah. And he was like, oh yeah, that is pretty funny. So he had done sort of the far left to far right thing at some point, and but then at some point Twitter banned all the alt-right people, and I don't know what ended up happening to him. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up, going back to socialism or something. Anyway, there just seems to be something that is in a certain personality type that is drawn to more extreme ideas than.
I mean, I wouldn't say I was, I hold extreme beliefs necessarily. Maybe in some cases, I mean, the certain moral principles, like I mentioned torture earlier, or I'm very much like the death penalty is an issue that I have extremely strong feelings on, and so in those cases maybe they can be called extreme because I don't admit of exceptions to them or whatever. But I mean, I can say my move from right to left meant that politically the values I really hold dear changed significantly, like the way I consider moral desert. Right? Like on the right, I had really bought into the sense that, you sink or swim, poverty, certain narratives about poverty, who is poor, why they're poor, the undeserving versus the deserving poor, bootstrap, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work ethic, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That was something that informed my politics when I was on the right. And now I have a totally different view of what human beings deserve, regardless of how they found themselves in certain straits or not. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like a extreme personality type that switched. And also, I would just have to say, I'm someone who, like, even when I was on the right, I think I was a relatively sensible conservative, I hope. And now that I'm on the left, I mentioned I'm on Dissent's editorial board. I write often for them. There are people, communists who consider Dissent squishy, and me, milquetoast, electoralist, right. Whatever terms you want to use. That's possible. So I don't want people to think I was like a far right, proto alt right kind of person when I was a young conservative. Mm-hmm. It's not quite exactly, and even now, again, it's complicated.
Right. Okay. So So your values have shifted in fundamental ways, and if that makes sense, I mean, things are changing in America. Being 10 years ago, we would have said being a socialist put you on the extreme end of American politics. Somewhat less so over the past 5 to 10 years. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk more about the show.
Sure.
And so one of the things I think I like about the show is it's about the conservative movement and conservative intellectuals and conservative ideas, and you take these ideas seriously. You are not, you're not just like, look at this bullshit, like these people are morons. And so I appreciate that. At the same time, the podcast was launched during the Trump era, and the Trump era is sort of like the end. I don't know. I mean, whether or not it's the end of the conservative movement, but ideas are much less important to the MAGA part of conservatism now than we would have said ideas were in the Bush administration. And I would say that Trump has no actual ideas himself. Like, his idea is just that he is Trump and he is the best, and whatever he says at any given moment is good and true. But then 5 minutes later he could be saying the reverse, and that also would be good and true. So that's my view. So one, is Trumpism absent of ideas, and is there some conflict between doing a podcast about conservative intellectuals when we just went through a period in which intellectualism on the right really didn't seem to matter at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I've been asked that in the context of the podcast yet, but I would say a couple things in response. One is, I mentioned a lot of the show is historical. So, whatever is happening in the present, there are episodes we would do just because we find the history involved interesting, right? Again, I mentioned National Review. We just did a big bonus episode on the 4 generations of L. Brent Bozell's, one of whom, Brent Bozell Jr., married Bill Buckley's sister, Patricia Buckley, and so was very involved in the founding of National Review, eventually became like a radical, like pro-Franco. His family lived in Franco of Spain, became like a proto-Catholic integralist, if that term means anything to your listeners or viewers, I should say. So the history there is, interesting to us regardless. But
and just to play that out, because I didn't listen to that, but I did read Peter wrote a piece on the similar idea. So then the third Brett Bozell founded this thing, Media Research Council Center or something, which was sort of like critiquing, bias in the mainstream press, that kind of thing. And then the fourth L. Brett Bozell was at the Capitol siege, and was he arrested? Yeah. So this is sort of like the rise and fall of the conservative empire told over 4 generations, all named the same, all named L. Brent Bozell. Which is you couldn't make this shit up.
But even if I think your description of Trump and his politics being bereft of ideas is correct. There are 2 kind of things I would say to know about that. We don't just describe conservative ideas necessarily. I mean, obviously you can't talk about politics without talking about ideas, but, you can see and say, when you read Bill Buckley's editorial in National Review defending segregation and the Jim Crow South, and he explicitly says that the white people in the South should prevail politically, even if they don't prevail numerically. And you see then the kind of anti-democratic strain of the Republican Party and conservative movement, especially during the Trump era. It seems like the voter suppression laws we've seen in Georgia and other places just recently, that's kind of come back in a very explicit way. I don't know if it ever went away, but it's kind of there, present, and very visible right now. So you can see, if you look at conservative history, there is a genealogy there, right? So even if the current ideas aren't bereft, or the current right, or Trump himself and his administration were, not the most intellectual, not operating from a coherent set of ideological principles or anything, you can still see certain phenomenon today. There are deep roots. They have deep roots in conservative history. Mm-hmm. But I would also say, to me, one of the most interesting elements of the administration we just managed to survive was that because Trump himself did not have a coherent intellectual framework or ideology, conservative intellectuals tried to find one.
Right.
So there's now magazines and journals like American Affairs kind of dedicated to what would a more intellectual, rigorous Trumpism kind of be like? Yes. They might, given how Trump flamed out, they might not identify it so explicitly with Trump, but that's how it started. And I would say furthermore, you can see that right-wing intellectuals have this curious relationship to Trump. So one of the things I harped on was during the pandemic, it's not like they all parroted everything Trump said about the pandemic, about the coronavirus, and so on. But they would, kind of at one degree of remove from Trump, sort of help sow skepticism, right? They might be anti-mask. They might say that, these lockdowns are because modern man is secular and doesn't believe in God, so death is the worst thing possible. So, staving off death at all costs, even if it means shutting down the whole country, and permanent lockdown.
Yeah. So, is this our Reno piece you're referencing?
It's one of many, but Reno was one I've especially harped on. He's the editor of First Things, the so-called what's their tagline? Basically, the most important.
The Commonweal of the right is how I think of it as someone existing outside of the Catholic media ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah, and he had this bizarre flame out. Lots of people, performed very badly in the sort of intellectual movement.
It's not like they all just, the relationship between the ideas people and Trump was complicated. But even if they weren't, giving an intellectual gloss to everything he said directly, there was this way in which they were kind of triangulating, right? So there'd be Trump saying this, and there'd be the lib media and, the keyboard brigades working from home, white collar, who didn't care about staying home during the pandemic, or whatever. There'd be the mainstream liberal position on one side, and then Trump, and then the right wing intellectuals would have to sort of,
figure out some way to kind of give what Trump was doing maybe some gloss of plausibility, while also taking aim at the experts and elites who were trying to, control our lives, right? Right. Yeah. So
that's been interesting to track. That's one of the main things we've done, is not to try to find Trump's inner intellectual essence.
Well, which doesn't, that would be a fruitless search.
Does not exist.
Yeah.
Right. But to track how the intellectuals who ended up supporting him, backing him for president, even if there's like a 1 degree of separation there, or they're not, it was a reluctant decision to back him for president or whatever, there's still this complicated dance they're doing, and that Sam and I have tried to track that on the show.
Okay, so there's two questions I have prepared that could both flow from this. So one is, can there be Trumpism without Trump, which you alluded to? And the other one would be looking who, scorecard sort of thing, after action report of the conservative movement after Trump, who should get a feather in their cap and who should get a black mark. And so we could go with either one of those. I guess let's do Trumpism. Do you think there could be a Trumpism without Trump, or does that not make any sense?
No, I mean, it's complicated, but I would just say kind of two things. One, I do think there's some part of me that wants to say, no, there can't be Trumpism without Trump. Because to me, the whole thing somehow held together because of his showmanship, the bizarre things he could kind of get away with, in a sense that I think normal politicians wouldn't say or wouldn't try to get away with.
Right.
And it kind of all reached this absurd pitch that I think forced people to either love him or, be repelled by him. And so I think he generated a kind of enthusiasm, and people identified with him in a way they hadn't, among Republicans with a politician, I think, for a long time. And so I'm not sure whatever Trump's secret sauce was. I mean, it was amazing that he turned out 10 million more people than he did in 2016.
Yeah.
Right. So he was really driving people on the right in some way, or winning people over.
Yeah. And I want to say, I did a couple episodes before the election saying that Biden was going to win in a walk. I did one with Bob Wright, proprietor of Blogging Heads, because he was very pessimistic about Biden and worries about everything in general. And I was trying to say, no, Biden's going to win. Biden's going to win. And so I was right about that. But what I did get wrong was I didn't think Trump was going to pick up any new support. I was like, he's basically, unless you were with him from 2016, I don't see how you could who possibly was jumping on the Trump train, in the past couple of years. So I was wrong about that. You got 10 million more people.
Yeah. I mean, who lives through the pandemic, right? And
if you weren't already on board, yes, I truly don't understand that, but that's something I
want more of this.
Yeah, so that's very, very strange. But then, thankfully, Biden got 14 million more than Hillary Clinton did, or whatever. But yeah, so I would say no Trumpism without Trump. He is a unique historical figure, and Don Jr. can't do it. Sorry, Josh Hawley, you can't do it either, and certainly not Cruz or any of these other jokers. Something about his charisma, his showmanship, his brand, his just postmodern status as someone who watched Fox News and believed it, versus the normal people who appear on Fox News and know they're lying to the viewers. This is not going to be replicated, and just the fact existing outside the political system. Celebrity. There's no one else in the country who has this.
And not just a celebrity, but someone who did a reality TV show as this like genius businessman and boss.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, I don't know how you could prove this or what point is. My guess is that The Apprentice, like for a lot of the country, Trump was the Trump of The Apprentice.
Oh, for sure. I agree with that. Yeah. The Apprentice is the key to Trump becoming president. If the guy, Mark, what's his name? The guy who created Survivor and also The Apprentice, if that guy was never born, then Trump would not be president. I'm 100% sure of that. Because most people, if you grew up like I did in the New York City area, knew who Trump was like in the 80s and 90s, and then he became this figure where he would appear on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in a cameo, or sorry, the Drew Carey show. If the gang went from Cleveland to New York City, they would encounter Trump. But he really was washed up, circa 2002, and without the show created the image, and he became the image in this crazy way that is postmodern. It doesn't make any sense to me, but so I agree with that. So okay. So Trump, I don't think he's going to run again. I think he is much happier living in a country club in Florida than having to take all these meetings and try to take in this information he doesn't understand or care about. He likes the attention, but that's it. So I don't think he has no successor. If Mike Pence runs, he's not going to be Trump 2.0. It's going to be something. It's going to be more like George W. Bush or something. So I think there's no Trumpism without Trump. It can't be it's not going to be Tucker Carlson. It's not going to be Steve Bannon. There's no one else who has this insane spark of whatever that's inside him. That's where his soul would be. That can command tens of millions of Americans to believe whatever he says at any moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who should we give a gold star to in the conservative movement, and who should we say tut after the end of Trump's term. Who do you think is anyone from the Never Trump conservatives would be the obvious people? Do you think they deserve plaudits from us for resisting Trump, whereas people like Rusty Rayno, swallowed Trumpism whole hog and tried to justify it in crazy ways, or do they not deserve any plaudits either?
I mean, that's a tough question to answer because I'm torn about it. I mean, there's a part of me that has the online lefty on Twitter who wants to be really snarky about everything, but I'm not actually. And I think a decision to actually not back Trump is something that deserves moral credit. It's like the lowest barrier, right? It should be so obvious. But the reason I'm kind of hesitant, though, to still give them much credit is I know some of them have, Stuart Stevens wrote a book that kind of was a mea culpa, that kind of looked at the Republican Party politics.
This guy he was in the Bush administration. He was one of the press secretaries or something. Is that what you're talking about?
He's a campaign guy.
Oh no, he's one of the
Stuart
McCain
Stevens.
guys. Okay, one of the McCain guys
just a campaign guy in general on the right. So a few of them have kind of acknowledged that Trump didn't come from nowhere, that he was riding energies, that the Republican Party had tried to ride for decades, really, kind of racial backlash, kind of code words, the old Lee Atwater story, right? You don't have to say the N-word if you just talk about welfare queens and, those kinds of things enough. So the reason I'm hesitant to give them more credit is I do think a lot of them had a very nefarious influence on American politics for decades and decades. And now, they do the minimal thing and try to and say, well, we're against Trump. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to evaluate that in a broader sense. I'm glad for anyone who decided not to vote for Trump, because I think the things he did to our country, especially the mishandling of the pandemic, to just take the most obvious example, I think it's plausible to say hundreds of thousands of Americans are dead because of his incompetence and the kind of just outright failures of his administration, right? So anyone who votes against that deserves something. But I'm not sure how much more credit I give a lot of the Never Trump people otherwise, just because not many of them, I think, have done a full accounting of how we got to Trump and how, this is one of the themes of my podcast, too, is that there's real continuity between elements of conservative politics in the Republican Party and Trump. He's not a total break with what we saw before. And so the people who for years helped elect Republicans and who, who's the bald Never Trump guy, Rick.
Yeah, I can never keep all those guys straight. He's one of the Lincoln Project.
Yeah. I mean, this is a guy who, along with, well, maybe I shouldn't use some of these people who are involved in Republican campaigns. Maybe you can cut that. I'm not, I don't want to name names, but, people who are involved in Republican campaigns for years and did things like put gay marriage on the ballot in Ohio in 2004, right? Like that is running on bigotry. That's what they were trying to use people's fear of gay people to get George W. Bush reelected. Now for this person to act like Trump came from nowhere and isn't really represent the Republican Party. Well, he's different in some ways, but there are other continuities. And so these people who, again, worked in Republican politics for years and fed some of the baser instincts and impulses on the right, just voting against Trump, I'm not sure how much credit to give them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you make me think of a metaphor that I probably didn't. This is too clever for me to come up with, but I remember at least I was pushing it in 2016. Was that Trump was what is like an opportunistic infection that took over the GOP, which had cancer but didn't know it. So like only a weakened body could have been taken over by Trump, the parasite or the infection. But if the body hadn't been weakened, then they would have been able to successfully reject the infection.
Yeah.
And I think that 5 years later, I think that stands.
Yeah. I mean, like, for example, the people instrumental in John McCain choosing Sarah Palin as his running mate. I mean, Palin to me is probably one of the most obvious, like, forerunners of Trump, given the kind of connection with her and the emerging Tea Party, plus her own, like, ignorance and yet ignorance combined with a certain telegenic showmanship.
And the reality TV angle. She's been on multiple reality TV shows since falling out of public.
So the people responsible for her being on a national ticket, telling me that Trump came from nowhere or he's some kind of break with the old Republican Party. Come on, it's not serious.
Yeah. So a lot of the Never Trump people who stuck with it were or are neoconservatives. And so one theory, and I think this is the theory that Bob Wright has and he's written about, is that, they left Trump because they didn't think Trump would implement their preferred foreign policy. And so they're glomming on to the Democrats now, hoping that, the neoconservative foreign policy can continue now that, Bill Kristol and Jennifer Rubin and Max Boot are like telling people to vote for Democrats. That's like the cynical point of view. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, we did an episode with Sam Moyn, who some of your viewers might know. He's a Yale professor and has written very critically of the Never Trumpers. And this is part of the argument he makes. Is it really they're now kind of going back to their roots in the Democratic Party? Because neoconservatives. Some of them, prior generation would have called themselves Scoop Jackson Democrats.
Right.
So the neoconservative movement has as much to do with the changing nature of the Democratic Party as it did them moving right in some ways, especially on foreign policy. But I mean, I think what you just suggested, Bob Wright's argument, I think that's probably true of some of them to a degree, but I think there's more at work too. I cut you off. Give me another.
Okay, well, actually, I disagree with Bob on this, and I have a less cynical. Usually, the most cynical explanation makes sense to me. Less cynically, I actually do think. I mean, what separates the neoconservatives from in my view, other members of the conservative movement, intellectual sphere, is like they really do believe stuff, and also a number of them are Jews, and like a lot of the people who defected against Trump were Jewish conservative intellectuals, and like, you can't help but think it was because they saw an echo of Hitler's rise in the rise of Trump. And they did not, so they saw the danger of Trump, whereas a lot of conservative intellectuals just saw, like, the potential promise of Trump and thinking, oh, we can rein this guy in and we can get something out of this. He'll rile up the crowds, but we'll get our preferred policy implemented. And so I think I would give a feather in the cap to people, like Kristol, and so forth, who, had, the legacy of the Nazi Party and the Holocaust, still weigh on them, and they, saw the potential threat of Trump. Obviously, Trump is not Hitler. He did not institute anything close to fascism. Although this is obviously something you mentioned, you talked about on the show. In my view, he was far too. I mean, fascists believe in something. Trump doesn't believe in anything, as I said, and he's also super incompetent. So it's hard to institute a fascist state if you're just a total bumbling fool. So there's that. But yeah, I think it's not purely cynical for a lot of them. I mean, Jennifer Rubin, I don't know. She seems like a totally cynical character, and she just totally flipped on a dime from being the most pro-Romney, anti-Obama, blogger out there to just being rah-rah, Nancy Pelosi or whatever. But I do think some of the more intelligent, thoughtful types, really did see the danger of Trump and tried to fight against it within the party, and then turned against the party and are basically out of essentially part of the Democratic coalition now. Yeah. Although it's how many the neoconservatives are not a voting bloc. It's such an elite concern, the things they care about. Yeah. So it's not like they really have people they bring along with them in the populace. Sure. It's how they sway. It's how they formulate ideas and so forth.
Yeah. No, I think there's something to that. I mean, that was part of the ambivalence in my first answer, why I said, I want to give them this much credit. Bill Kristol's father, Irving Kristol, he wrote, it was either a book or an essay called 2 Cheers for Capitalism. And I'm going to say 1 cheer for Bill Kristol. It's not nothing, but I actually think you're right about the importance of being Jewish, the fact that many neoconservative intellectuals are, because, there was this great conversation you can watch on YouTube between Martin Amis and Christopher Hitchens on Saul Bellow, Judaism and anti-Semitism, or Israel and anti-Semitism. So it takes up the question of anti-Semitism. I forget who Hitchens was quoting, but he said Jewish people were a seismic people, meaning, the canary in the coal mine. You see something like Trump and it's not good, for reasons of historical experience and just, when you're a minority, religious, ethnic, or otherwise, I think certain things seem even more menacing to you than they might to other people for good reason. And so I do think, with that combined with the fact that neoconservatives had always argued for if I can give them some credit, that America was a universal nation in the sense of, it led them astray, right? Thinking American political institutions could maybe be, transplanted to the Middle East too easily. That's kind of the bad side of universalism. But they did in comparison to paleoconservative intellectuals, people like Pat Buchanan, for example, no friend of the Jews, him, I think it's fair to say. They wanted to portray American ideals as universal ones, that America was based on certain intellectual principles and ideas that, in theory, anyone of any race, religion, or creed could embrace, right?
Yeah.
And that is a less again, I mentioned the problems with it already. There are others we could discuss, but that is a less odious political vision than the alt-right, Trump, and other strains of conservatism. Mm-hmm. It's true. So I think I'm happy to meet you halfway and say I don't entirely disagree with your alternative explanation. I would imagine in some cases a little bit of both are at work, and I think. But with some of them, I think you're probably right that it was a genuine repulsion at someone they knew was not going to be a friend to people like them.
Yeah, and honestly, the people as a Jewish American, the people who disgust me the most are the Jews who got into bed with Trump because they thought it'd be good for Israel or whatever other general concern. And I actually. Percolating in the back of my mind is writing or doing a podcast episode, although it's a very touchy subject, about how all the Jewish men who have performed very badly over the past 5, 6, 7 years, and so you have both Weinstein and Epstein, but then you have Mark Zuckerberg, and you have a lot of prominent wealthy Jewish men who continue to give money to Trump and the GOP. And where did this go wrong? And the list I made are all that I have about 15 or so thinking about are all men. And so I don't know how that exactly plays into it, but there is something there. And the Me Too movement and Trumpism, a lot of powerful Jewish men failed to meet the moment or just acted really badly. And so I've been thinking about, if anyone has an idea for someone I can talk to about this on the show, it's a very delicate subject, obviously. Leave a comment below. But yeah, okay. So something else that I've noticed, thinking about the conservative movement, is like, at certain times it was like a youth movement, and Buckley and Bozell sort of like came like right out of college and wrote the Got a Man at Yale and that other book, and and if we look at today, from what, as far as I can tell, like where are the young conservative intellectuals is what I'm thinking. Everyone who's gained prominence in the Trump era, who's like under 35, 40, like is some form of grifter. And it's people like Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, Jacob Wohl, the Gun Girl.
right.
Like these are all like scam artists of some sort or other. I mean, Shapiro is, in any case, he seems to actually believe in things, but where are there, or they're like, the people who are like Bronze Age pervert, and those like people who are just way off into like, race realism or whatever, like scientific racism.
Yeah.
And so do you see this also? Are there conservatives under 40 who are not insane? I don't know how old Sohrab Ahmari is. He might be under 40, but and then people who are who are like millennial or younger who are attached to the movement. So like a lot of them have sort of jumped ship. Or I'm thinking Will Wilkinson. He was never a conservative. He was a libertarian, but he's like fully, almost like a Democrat or socialist or something now. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I knew Will slightly back when I was a young conservative, when he worked for the Institute for Humane Studies, which is kind of libertarian, Koch-funded outfit, which I did seminars and events with. So it's been interesting to watch Will evolve over the years, as I have. But to your question of kind of under 40s, it's hard to say because someone like Buckley and Bozell, you're right. I mean, I think there's either an article or a book called The Other Side of the 60s, meaning we associate the 60s with like young hippies and Woodstock and things like that, but there was lots of young conservatives who rallied. The Young Americans for Freedom was started by Buckley. The founding meeting was at his ancestral home in Sharon, Connecticut. You're right. It was a youth movement to some extent. And even if you go back to like the Reagan years, there was a sense of like young conservatives coming to Washington. That was in the mix too. But you're right. Now it's not quite the same. And that the most prominent people are these grifters. I would just say there's a couple things going on that would be worth interesting if I'm trying to be generous. One is I said Trumpism won't really survive without Trump. And I mean that mostly as a electoral possibility. But I do think intellectually he did kind of help smash away some conservative orthodoxies that had been long kind of, I don't know, they lingered. I don't know, they were kind of waiting to be blown apart by someone like Trump, meaning especially like doctrinaire libertarian economics. Of course, the only thing Trump did was really cut taxes, wage some trade war, that kind of thing. But
and cut some checks over the past year.
Right. But you can see that Trump, it wasn't totally implausible to say Trump represented some kind of different stance in terms of political economy than the traditional, more libertarian economic Republican positions had been. And so I think to the extent, the Trump era will give us kind of younger intellectuals doing interesting things, I think it'll be people trying to imagine what a more blue-collar, worker-friendly Republican economic agenda might be. I mean, I still disagree with these people. I think in a lot of ways it's not as different as they sometimes make it seem. Mm-hmm. But I mean people like Orrin Cass, his American Compass Project, and some of the younger conservatives who write for that, trying to sketch a more worker-friendly Republican economic agenda. Mm-hmm. I think, even people like you mentioned, Ross Douthat, his brand of conservatism, I think now is probably more plausible than it might have been when he and Ryan wrote Sam's Club Republicanism, or Grand New Party it was called.
Yes. That was the article with Sam's Club Republicanism, I think, and Grand Party was the...
So circa 2008, they were talking about some changes to how the Republican Party handles things like economics.
Yeah, and Reihan is now the president of the American Enterprise Institute, right, or something like that.
Manhattan Institute.
Okay. And so he's certainly risen. Yeah. He also, I mean, he was a Blogging Heads guy back in the day and was a great. I mean, he's just like one of the all-time great talkers. And he is somewhat pulled back from the public stage, as far as I can tell, for reasons I don't know why. But Ross. I mean, if we were going to put a feather in anyone's cap for on the conservative side over the past 5 years, I would give it to Ross for pretty consistently like being right about things more or less. I mean, he was wrong about some big stuff, but he didn't abandon conservatism, but he was pretty much often a critic of Trump, explicating conservative ideas for the raw audience, and I think an intellectually honest way. That's just my opinion. But he is also, I mean, I don't know if generally I think, I mean, he is over 40, I would guess, as is Reihan. Yeah. So I don't know this arbitrary cutoff I came up with. I don't know if they would fit in. I mean, there's people like...
I mean, as a 39-year-old, I'm grateful for the 40 cutoff.
Right.
So I'm still young.
Well,
but Ross is maybe
if we understand
3 or 4 years older.
Millennials, the millennial generation supposedly starts in 81. And so millennials are turning 40 this year, the oldest millennials. And so... and the media's been obsessed with millennials for 20 plus years. So we're like, what are the millennial conservative and what are these types doing? I mean, maybe, like J.D. Vance would be a type.
Well, he was what I was going to mention. I think it's telling. I mean, I thought of him because, I mean, that book has been one of the, for better or worse, probably worse, one of the most discussed and debated books of the Trump era.
Yeah.
I do think what you saw was, I mean, it kind of encapsulates a lot of what I've been saying, right? It was pitched as like this guy from Trump country now understands this phenomenon, right? So the book gets published in the midst of Trump. I think it was published in the summer of 2016, actually. So before Trump was elected, but after he'd already become the Republican nominee.
Right. So this is Hillbilly Elegy is the title of the book. Turned into a movie in the past year, and Glenn Close is now as an Oscar nomination for portraying the grandmother of this memoir.
So that was a breakout book, and I think JD is obviously genuinely smarter than Jacob Wool or
although Jacob Wool has somehow managed to not end up in prison still as of this recording, so he knows something. But he's not an intellectual.
But when you look at someone like Vance, it's now you can see it. It seems like he might run for Senate in Ohio, or at least that's making moves in that direction. So it's really going to be a question: will there actually be something different, substantively, deeply different about his economic program, or will it be kind of some of the same old, maybe some rhetorical moves in one direction, maybe a few policies that seem more worker friendly, or will it just be culture war against Silicon Valley? Or, it's when they talk about woke capitalism, it's obvious that the woke part is what really pisses them off, and it's not the capitalism part. And someone like Josh Hawley, he's going after Facebook and some of these tech companies mostly for like censoring conservatives, not because like the concentration of economic power is bad or leading to, certain outcomes that are just generally against the common good or something. It's they're mad that Facebook is censoring or Twitter is censoring conservatives, supposedly, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that to me is when I think about breakout intellectuals or kind of a rising generation of conservative intellectuals, it really remains to be seen whether they do anything interesting or whether it's just kind of mostly rhetorical shifts, kind of adding new arguments to updated circumstances.
Okay, we had a tech problem there and lost just a little bit, hopefully not too much, but we're going to move on to one or two more questions. So one thing I do want to ask you about is, as someone who was in the conservative movement for part of your life, what aspects of conservative thinking do you still value or find valuable, or what do you or was there a total rejection, or how do you understand that?
Well, I get asked that question from time to time, and I'm not sure how best to answer it, other than to say, temperamentally, I know I said I kind of had gone from one pretty, not extreme, but not a particularly squishy moderate conservatism to a leftism that isn't particularly at the center of our politics either. So that might give the impression that I'm temperamentally not that conservative, but in some ways I still am. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm affiliated with Dissent, not Communist Party publications or something, whatever it would be. And so I do think I still have a sense that politics is complicated. I'm much more invested in electoral politics than some people on the left, because I don't think, or I just think it's, that's how you make change. You could hold out for revolution, or you could hold out for some, cataclysmic change, but I'm still committed to doing what's possible to make the world slightly more just and slightly more decent and slightly more generous to the people who live in it now. Then, I'm still committed to that. And I'm not knocking other perspectives either. But I'm just saying, that marks me as someone who's willing to work within the system in some ways. And I would say when I think about those kinds of questions, I do think, say one conservative, this can be overblown. I don't want to, give the wrong impression. But our second episode on how conservatives argue, we look back at a book called Albert Hirschman's book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. And one of the common things conservatives say is that, well, if you try to make this change to improve things, actually the opposite will happen, right? And lots of bad things will come from mucking around and trying to change things too much. And I don't buy that, but I on the other hand, I don't think change is cost free, right? Or that there's no possibility of unintended consequences. And so I would like to think that at its very best, conservatism involves a certain epistemic humility, or a sense that the world is complicated and people are complicated, and just simplistic, straightforward change might not always be the way it goes. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't fight for better things, or for a more just economy or healthcare system or whatever it might be. But it's just that society involves a lot of moving parts, and I think to the extent people on the left kind of can be aware of that and factor that into some of their judgments or policy recommendations or whatever, that's probably something I still carry over from my conservative past.
Mm-hmm. And
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And
and I'm not trying to say people I'm the one who knows the world's complex and other people don't. I'm not going for that. I'm more or less just trying to say that I do think that again, the very best conservatism has a certain humility at its heart, and I think sometimes that humility can kind of turn into a more rigid obstinacy against doing anything at all. You can become too enamored of complexity. But I do think that sense that human schemes can go awry, that human beings are not perfectible, the old, Isaiah Berlin, crooked timber kind of idea. That's, maybe that's because I'm still religious and I believe in original sin, and that human beings are a mix of, noble impulses and baser instincts, and that, that kind of anthropology, that view of human beings, I think is one. I mean, if there's something interesting about my leftism, it's probably that as a religious person, it coexists with these views of human beings that are pretty not pessimistic, but at least well aware of the fact that, you're not going to create the new Soviet man. You're not, utter transformation is not really possible.
Right. Okay. So the fallibility of man.
Right.
You're accepting. So that's interesting. Very interesting. And I'm thinking, there's parts of the far left who think there's going to be some kind of revolution, and I don't think that's ever going to happen in America. I mean, we came close to some sort of collapse, but that hasn't happened yet. But also, you could trace modern conservative thought to Burke's reaction to the failures of the French Revolution, and the fact that there's always people eager for a revolution, despite the fact that most of them fail, and some of them fail horribly with reigns of terror and so forth. So yeah, that's worth keeping in mind. And also, epistemic humility. If I had to, find the living antonym of epistemic humility, it would be former President Donald Trump, who thought he knew more than anyone. He was the expert of everything. Right. Whatever he said was right. And yeah, so he never listened to anyone except like things he would see on Fox News. So obviously things went awry in conservatism, and they ventured very far from that into this cult of personality around Trump. Okay, so maybe this will be the last question. Somewhat a different topic, but so you are an editor at Commonweal, and we have a liberal Catholic president suddenly, and. I mean, so Biden is the second Catholic president. First question is JFK considered a liberal Catholic president or not? And second, is it like, is this like high times at Commonweal because it's like your ship has come in that a liberal Catholic faith is now living inside Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I'm not a big JFK fan. I've read enough Gary Wills and Seymour Hersh and all that to, idolize Kennedy. I shouldn't quite quote Christopher Hitchens a second time in this episode, but he has the great line. He said, "Do you remember where you were the day JFK almost got us all killed?" I mean, Cuban Missile Crisis, etc.
As time has gone on, I mean, during our childhood, I think there was still this idea that he was like this golden figure, but
Camelot. Yeah,
exactly. A mystical figure almost, and
but
so the mythology has definitely been tarnished as more and more comes out, and people look at what he actually believed and did.
But more importantly, I hadn't quite thought of it this way, but if you remember when Kennedy was running for president, he had to go down to Texas and tell everyone, "I'm not going to take orders from the Pope," right? So my friend, who's a theologian at Villanova University, Massimo Fagioli, he has a book that he published recently called Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. And he says that Biden is our first president to publicly express a Catholic soul, meaning he's like publicly Catholic in a way JFK wasn't, and maybe even couldn't have been. And I was struck by just how Catholic Biden's inauguration was. Father Leo O'Donovan, the former president of Georgetown University, gave one of the prayers. The Bible, Biden put his hand on, had the big Celtic cross on it. He quoted St. Augustine, who called us a saint of my church, during his inaugural address. And I think even as a candidate, that because Biden's very public grieving, his wife and daughter killed in the car accident, his son Beau died of brain cancer in 2015. Like he's grieved an unusual amount publicly. Yeah. And so I think his faith has been very bound up with that. I mean, it was Father O'Donovan who who said the funeral mass for Beau, the same Catholic priest who gave the prayer at his inauguration. So I think Biden kind of wears his Catholicism on his sleeve, and it's sort of from a different era, like when people thought Catholicism could maybe be a part of, kind of liberal mainstream politics in the U.S., sort of that, mid-century whatever, right? For better or worse.
Yeah, I mean, so I think
but now, post. I mean, I'm about to publish an essay on the religious left, and one of the points in it is that Gary Wills has the great phrase, the reign of the two Johns, John F. Kennedy and Pope John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council. But we now know that, like, the Second Vatican Council is a huge point of contention in the Catholic Church. And a lot of the right-wing critics of Pope Francis in the Church and were people who also, some of them, like Archbishop Vigano, were a part of the Stop the Steal rally in Washington. So, now, it just seems like things have fractured, right? And the culture wars emerged kind of after Biden was already an adult. And he seems to kind of be that throwback to, like, a pre-culture war happier sense that, like, his faith is just, a part of his democratic politics, and it's all, it all kind of works.
Yeah.
So, he wears it on his sleeve, and I even like the American Recovery Act, the National Catholic Reporter editorialized this was Catholic social teaching in practice, which, from one angle, that's plausible perhaps. But so I don't know. Biden's not a hero of the left by any means. I think I've been pleasantly surprised by how his administration has been going, in the sense of things like saying deficits don't really matter that much, and the key thing is to spend money now. Like, that seems like he's learned lessons from the Obama years.
For sure.
So, like, as a left Catholic, or however you want to describe me, like, I'm probably fonder of Biden than I would be otherwise, because he's this Catholic grandfather. Sam, my podcast co-host, once said, Matt, I said, I don't know why, I just have this soft spot for, like, 78-year-old Catholic grandpa Joe Biden. And Sam said, Matt, that's because he's the same age as all of your priests. And I thought, well, that's kind of true.
That's interesting. And there was, there were people, even who were not Jewish, who called Bernie Sanders Zadie, which is the Yiddish word for grandfather. So there's some connection there. And I've noted this on Twitter, when you were saying about Biden somehow hovering above the culture war somehow. Biden is not a baby boomer. He was born in 42 or 43. And as I put it, half jokingly, he actually believes this shit. He's not, there's less irony in what he says, it's seemingly, than, a baby, someone who was like 10 years younger would have had. And so his politics are different. He grew up when there probably, you tell me that there must have been actual still anti-Catholic discrimination in his childhood that his living relative, and especially his living relatives, must have experienced. And so that is different. And so he, he was an adult when Vatican II was happening.
Exactly. Right. I mean, he would have heard the Mass in Latin until he was in his 20s, I think. But also, he does come from a sort of particular Irish Catholic subculture. I know, there's a lot of jokes about he's not actually that Irish, but I don't think that means it's false that he didn't exist in that milieu, right, growing up. And it's, when you look at, the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, it was that period of time when, Catholics were going from ethnic enclaves, Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic, to the church kind of being more mainstream. Like, John F. Kennedy's election was a significant inflection point in that. So I think Biden kind of has that weird kind of one foot in both worlds, where he really did experience a different kind of culture, especially different kind of Catholic culture when he was growing up, probably, and then was a part of Catholics entering the mainstream. And I think that when I said he kind of wears his faith on his sleeve and kind of it just mixes in with his political views, I think that's kind of what I mean. He kind of has some of that confidence of an older era that predates the culture wars, when faith was, I don't want to say it was less contentious, but whatever it wasn't the culture wars exactly as we've, lived through them.
Yeah.
So I find Biden actually extremely interesting as a religious figure. And I actually, I might get in trouble for saying this, but even his calls for healing and unity and dialogue or whatever, I tend not to dismiss them. As you said, I think he does believe it. And I think as a religious person, as a Christian, I'm something like reconciliation, and it can't happen without truth. It can't happen with admission of wrongdoing on certain people's parts. But who can't look at our country and think something has gone really wrong, right? And something more just basic decency between us, not least in our politics, wouldn't be a bad thing.
Yes.
And for Biden, I think there's something from his faith that stems from too. I'm not saying he wouldn't say you have to be Catholic to think that. Of course not. I'm just saying there are certain things about Biden that I probably interpret relatively sympathetically, because I see them as stemming from real convictions he has, rather than just being the typical rhetoric of kumbaya. Let's all get together and be cool together and get along.
And whether some sort of national healing after the various crises of the past 2 decades is possible, I don't know. It seems like we do need it. I have no idea if it can happen, or if we're somehow fractured in a way that can't be fixed. The fact that he's offered himself as a healing, calming presence. I saying a return to normalcy, was what he was offering, and that's kind of what we're getting. Just because the Trump years were such an aberration, and people don't want to be thinking about the president every hour of the day and whether he's doing something crazy or not. So I mean, I've been surprised by how things have played out over the past 2 months, and I think a lot of people, including myself, I thought he would just be Sleepy Joe. I've sort of like underestimated what he could achieve or wanted to achieve, and it's everything is very slim margin, and so who knows what'll happen. But I'm more optimistic than I was a couple months ago. Okay, anything else you want to say? Or should we end it there? I think we've gone on over an hour at this point.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, let's end it there. So thanks for coming on. And so it's Know Your Enemy is the name of the podcast. Links to everything will be below on the Blogging Heads site. Check it out.
Including our Patreon.
Yes, you're on Patreon. And then do you also have an offer with Dissent Magazine where if you subscribe to one or the other, you get both or something? Yeah,
I should have said that Dissent sponsors the podcast, so to speak. Sponsor seems to be the best language we've come up with. But as part of that, they not only help us promote it, but if you subscribe for $10 a month on our Patreon, you get a free digital subscription to Dissent. So, which is, I love Dissent. I'm a subscriber. Of course, I write for them and, are kind of very involved with them. But I think it's a really important magazine with a political tradition I identify with and think is important. So it's a great 2-for-1 deal. And of course, everyone should read Commonweal magazine too, especially if you want insight into our liberal Catholic president. No better place to read.
Yeah. Just a side note, you work with my former editor at this aforementioned humor magazine, Molly, who is from Scranton. Has she written on Biden Scranton at all?
I don't know if she has. I should ask her because I edit her. Most of the time I edit her columns for Commonweal, and you go back and forth about what you're going to write about, and I should. She is Molly from Scranton.
Yes. And so that I will just, if you want to slip an idea to one of your writers. So check that out. Check it all out. You're also on Twitter. Is it just Matthew Sitman?
Yeah, at Matthew Sitman.
And I am at RACW on Twitter. And, you can follow us, subscribe to us, do all sorts of things. You can rate and review this particular podcast, Culturally Determined, on iTunes, and that helps the algorithms and so forth. Okay, so let's wrap it up there. Matthew, thank you so much. Thanks for doing this, and thanks to all of our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Alrighty.